Hello everyone, Fraud Review here, and today we'll be talking about my favorite magician, Asuka. It's no secret that Asuka is a very controversial character. Some people even have an almost lore-accurate hatred of the character, which is crazy. It's not like he actually blew up Japan. Look, it's somewhere on this map. I'd point to it, but I play Slayer, so I'm practically illiterate. Unlike Slayer, Asuka's reception started out really positive. A lot of people were initially impressed with the difficulty and depth of his kit and were excited to see where talented players like Gobou would take this character. Unfortunately, this honeymoon phase fizzled out shortly after. Dealing with and even watching Asuka became more of a chore than a spectacle for a lot of people. But why? Since I play Asuka myself, we'll be taking a look at both sides of this dilemma. Why Asuka players get frustrated with Asuka and why non-Asuka players get frustrated with Asuka. But I wouldn't put well over 1000 hours into this character if I didn't enjoy him, so we'll also be talking about what I and many others love about Asuka. And since I know what everyone is here for, let's start with the spicy part. While there's infinite variations of how people express their hate towards Asuka, ranging from light-hearted and mostly joking hate bombing to straight up telling Asuka players to attempt the room temperature challenge, most criticism about Asuka usually boils down to one main argument: the pressure is uninteractable and or boring. If you've made the mistake of actually using Twitter before, you have probably seen a hand or maybe a few thousand handfuls of clips like this. At first glance, this looks horribly painful and you can usually see that a lot of people agree with this, but is it actually uninteractable? The short answer is no, and before you get ready to track me down and send me to the pearly gates, let me explain this one. There's a lot more to it, I promise. While strings like these look absolutely impossible to break out of without accepting a very one-sided trade offer to get into the next round immediately, it's actually far from the truth. A lot of these posts have multiple points where you can break out of the pressure by engaging in a rock paper scissors scenario. Most of them even have sequences where the opponent could have taken their turn back without any risk. So why don't they just break out of it and win the game? Are they stupid? The answer is knowledge checks, and before you end me, hear me out for a second. For most characters, knowledge checks boil down to a few common tactics that are incredibly tough to deal with if you don't know exactly what to do. This makes them really good at just nuking players that are not experienced at the matchup. A good example of this is letting Nago just Fukio in your face all the time. If Nago goes into Fukio without a clone, you need to check that with a fast button. Not checking Fukio gives Nago basically infinite pressure options for almost no resources. Depending on the character, you might have more or less of these, and this is where the problem starts to arise. Asuka has a lot of knowledge checks, so many in fact that there's no way even the Asuka player can be ready for every situation fate throws at them. Unlike with other characters, it's unreasonable to expect the player to be ready for all of them, especially if they don't play the character themselves. This problem gets even bigger when you consider that not a lot of people actually play Asuka and even less play him to a decent or professional level. Why spend so much time and effort to learn a matchup that comes up once in a blue moon? And even when it does, the chances for the Asuka to be so good that you absolutely need to know all the ins and outs of the matchup to have any chance are very slim. His pressure is not broken because there's nothing you can do, it's broken because you don't know what to do. Figuring that out yourself is extremely difficult, especially mid-game, and even when you spend a lot of time and effort on preparing for this matchup, there's no way you'll be ready for everything. Of course, Asuka has really strong pressure outside of knowledge checks as well. Some of his mix, while situational, is incredibly hard to avoid, and his damage is actually surprisingly good for a projectile character. It's just that these knowledge checks make a pressure that's already tough to deal with almost impossible to escape. Especially for the average player. Even if you know a lot of the common knowledge checks, chances are that you're still letting Asuka get away with murder for the better part of his pressure. And while we're talking about how the average player interacts with Asuka, let's take a look at the Asuka player side of this. It's no secret that Asuka's pressure is incredibly diverse and tough to deal with, but unlike some other characters' pressure flowcharts, his pressure can be very tricky to pull off properly. Asuka's resource is the main factor in this. Common problems are getting bursted at the wrong time, losing RPS in a very crucial spot like with low mana or a bad hand that you really need to fix, or the worst of them all, bad RNG sending you straight to hell. If you're incredible at managing your resource, these become less of a problem, but sometimes things just go sideways in all the worst ways possible, no matter how good you are. And when that happens, you can start praying to whatever deity you believe in, because at that point only divine intervention can save you. As you can probably tell, going from living your best life while winning to there's nothing we can do because of RNG or a singular mistake is incredibly frustrating. Other characters can have very similar situations, especially with opponents like Slayer or Nago or in bad matchups, but Asuka is very consistently volatile. Let's sum up the whole pressure segment to get everyone on the same page before we move on. Asuka's pressure is really strong. His access to countless knowledge checks makes it even more potent, as it's hard to be aware of the full game you're playing, which can be very frustrating. His strings are very long in general, and this just further exacerbates the frustration. To properly learn the matchup, you have to invest a lot of time, which rarely pays off due to how small Asuka's player base is. To add to that, it's really hard to prepare for all the different situations Asuka can put you in. Labbing against Asuka can be pretty tough. The best way to learn this matchup in my opinion is just learning Asuka yourself, but that's a lot to ask for a single matchup. On the Asuka player side, his pressure, while incredibly rewarding, is stressful and often difficult to pilot and can make or break rounds in a single interaction. Volatile characters usually have incredibly high highs but utterly devastating lows. Asuka is no exception to this. But there's an extra layer to this whole difficult and stressful deal, so let's get that out of the way before we move over to neutral and defense. While there's some people that strongly disagree with this, most people agree that Asuka is one of, if not the hardest character in Strive. This also means that he falls victim to the very common dilemma which I like to call the difficult character effect. But what is the difficult character effect? If you play a difficult character, you have probably thought about it a few times already. Don't you hate it when you spend hours and hours trying to work on your Asuka game plan? Practicing keeping your APM high, learning new setups to make use of certain card situations, learning how to safely manage mana to not spontaneously combust, and all that jazz just to get completely destroyed by a Slayer that pressed like 3 buttons and had their last conscious thought like 2 weeks ago. And you can't help but get frustrated by the fact that you put so much effort and time into a hard character to get mediocre results, when you could also just invest way less effort for way better results on an easy and consistent character. That's the difficult character effect, and it only gets worse the weaker your character is compared to the rest of the cast. Some difficult characters can escape it by just being in their own league of strength like Season 2 Happy Chaos, but most difficult character players will feel like this at some point in their life. But is all this really true? This is a tough one to answer since it's impossible to really accurately measure effort, but in my opinion it's not. And even if it was, thinking like this is very harmful for your general mindset as well as your improvement. Playing a difficult character means that you'll have to develop a unique skill set like resource management or unorthodox pressure sequences. This usually comes with the benefit of being able to ignore other important factors or having privileges in certain game states, like Asuka's incredible pressure or Happy Chaos winning neutral for whiffing a button. Players who put a lot of effort into these unorthodox skill sets often lack proficiency in other important skill sets, like neutral interactions outside of their own mechanics. Like overcoming neutral without resource for characters like Happy Chaos or Asuka, and more commonly defense. Yes, I'm looking at you, Asuka that uses YRC the moment you're forced to block. It's not that the effort that you put into the character is strictly bonus effort other people don't put in, it's just a different kind of effort. Of course there's a lot of nuance to this. Sometimes characters really do get away with putting in a lot less effort, especially when you consider situations like massive character strength gaps. But at the end of the day, we all put effort into our characters, and if you feel like you're wasting your time on a character, you should consider making the switch and experiencing the other side of that coin. But before you jump the gun on this and immediately switch off of your character, consider why you've spent so much time practicing. Was it really just about playing a good character and winning, or was it about the process of learning and your general enjoyment of the character's design and game plan? Does it even matter if you put in more or less effort than others? But enough soul searching, for now we have a character to dissect. If you'd like to see more of this mindset type of content, feel free to let me know in the comments too. Dealing with Asuka's neutral is mainly dependent on two factors. How much do you know about the matchup and how to pressure Asuka's game plan efficiently, and how well does your character actually do in this matchup? For most matchups, assuming you are proficient in dealing with cubes, Asuka doesn't have a particularly strong neutral game. Some might even say it's downright horrible, but that might be a bit of an over-exaggeration. Both his regular buttons as well as most of his cubes are incredibly committal. For the normals, mainly 2D, 2S and 6P come to mind, as the other stuff is not that good, especially fast slash. I despise you from the bottom of my heart. 2D is a great button, but the already massive recovery has you in counter state for its entire duration, so whiffing it is a great way to find out what the next round will go like. To add to that, its hurtbox is much worse than the visuals would have you believe. It has no low profile and extends your horizontal hurtbox considerably, which makes it lose consistently to stronger pokes. This gets worse when you consider that Asuka's only real low profile option is 6P. His 6P is more or less average, but due to Asuka's high commitment neutral plan via long recoveries on spells that might decide to just cease existing because your opponent dared to look at them funny, average just won't cut it. To add to that, the frame data and hitboxes just work out perfectly to have it clash very unfavorably into certain pokes like Kai Fast Slash. So your low profile option sometimes just decides that you are not worthy of getting rewarded for low profiling a poke. Thank you 6P. 2S is also relatively mid. A lot of people like to compare it to Happy Chaos 2S, but the key difference is that it's not only ever so slightly worse, but Asuka also has no gun. This turns a good poke that wins on hit, block and often whiff into a mediocre poke. And just like with 6P, mediocre is not always enough. As for the cubes, all of them have a relatively high recovery, which also has you in counter hit state since you realistically want to manage your resource after tossing a cube whenever you can. This doesn't really pair well with the fact that opponents can not only hit cubes to make them disappear, but can also cancel off of this pseudo clash, allowing a lot of characters to punish Asuka directly for using a cube at a lot of ranges. All this can be really frustrating for Asuka if the opponent is really good at properly working around cubes. But what if they are not that experienced with the matchup? The short answer, as with all things Asuka, is hell. Common mistakes include things like trying to dash block into cubes instead of breaking them, not breaking cubes with the right buttons, forgetting to check Asuka's available spells, or air dashing all over the place. Most of these mistakes get punished with immediate pressure, instant death, or a huge rock on your fragile head. Asuka heavily controls the pace of the matchup, and if you don't know how to properly deal with that, it can seem very hopeless. This isn't the case for all matchups of course. Some worse matchups for Asuka like Axel force him to play on their terms, which is really bad for him. But before we talk about that, let's check out the last major part of the game plan. Defense is actually a very simple case for Asuka, as is usually the case for resource-intensive characters that like to bend the rules a bit on offense or neutral. That's why for this section I won't really talk much about the opponent's side of this, because at this point you're all over the frustration and it's finally time to take it out on poor little Asuka. But how does that look for Asuka? Not so well. Like other resource characters, defense is where Asuka pays for the sins he committed on neutral or offense. His reversal is not only horrendous in startup and hitbox, allowing almost all characters to just safe jab or safe close slash it off of any knockdown. It's also hilariously telegraphed, as you can literally check if you can even do it. And of course you can't hesitate to use this incredibly risky reversal either, because if you take a little too long and block a little too much, fate might just decide that your mana is too low to use it now. If that happens, your already horrible reversal just turned into a dead slot in your hand that you'll have to deal with later. But fortunately for Asuka, there might not be a later. That's because his normals are also not really noteworthy. He has a legally mandated 5-frame 2P like every other DLC character, but that's about it. I've seen some people complain about his super taking turns back, but it's 7 frames of startup with no invul. If you leave that much of a gap in a hydrogen bomb versus coughing baby situation, you kind of drop the ball on pressure anyways. And even if it comes that far, most characters can just react with a counter super to do to Asuka what he did to Japan. Other than that, Asuka mainly just has to escape pressure honestly, like the footsie gods intended, or use system mechanics if he has them available. There's a tiny extra issue with Asuka's defense specifically though. As you might know, Asuka has a mana bar that decreases when he uses or manages spells. Unfortunately, or fortunately if you're the one running offense, this meter also decreases when Asuka blocks or gets hit. And we all know what happens when Asuka runs out of mana. This puts a very inconvenient timer on your defense, because breaking out too late means that your resource is long gone, making it even harder to recover and clutch out the round. On the other hand, trying to break out early can quickly turn into meeting God early. And while we're already talking about meeting God, let's check out the matchups. I don't want to draw out this section for too long, so I'll keep it short. Asuka has a pretty unfortunate matchup spread, be it Axel and cubes not being able to coexist, or Slayer just being unnatural at turning Asuka into a chalk outline on the floor. These bad matchups usually have things in common, like being able to clear cubes very effectively and punishing Asuka for cubes even from longer ranges. This forces Asuka to rely more on his pretty awkward normals, which are often too slow or too stubby in a lot of neutral situations, which is a recipe for pure frustration. Of course, Asuka has some good matchups as well. In these matchups, opponents usually struggle with punishing Asuka for dishing out cubes like there's no tomorrow. Or the cubes directly interfere with some of their prevalent neutral tools, like RNG's spin. Allowing Asuka to dish out cubes like this gives him way more chances to kickstart test case 3 and force a really tough neutral situation on you via things like bit shift 5. So now that we've looked at a lot of layers behind Asuka, let's sum up how all this manages to frustrate so many players. Asuka has strong pressure that gets even more ridiculous due to access to a lot of wacky knowledge checks. Failing these checks often results in free resets, which drags out the pressure, resulting in a very long and sometimes boring process. Learning absolutely all of these knowledge checks is an unreasonable expectation, especially because learning a majority of them requires a tremendous amount of effort already. Asuka is a rare character, so there's not only less incentive to be prepared, but also less ways to actually learn this matchup outside of learning Asuka yourself. Similarly to pressure, neutral can also be hard to work around depending on matchups and how proficient you are at them. For Asuka players themselves, he is a very high effort and high stress character. He is also incredibly volatile. Minor mistakes can lose games that were going well in the blink of an eye. His normal buttons are very slow and stubby. This is generally just frustrating, especially if you are forced to use them. His defense is also rather lacking. The addition of resource loss puts a lot of pressure on the player. After looking at all this, I'd say that Asuka is definitely not a badly designed character, more so just a really weird one, which can be good or bad depending on how you look at it. While it can be frustrating to play against him, especially when you come unprepared, it's never unfair. You just have to find out if bothering with all the ins and outs of dealing with him is worth it for you or not. But I'd love to know how you feel about this character and possibly what changes you would implement to help with the issues he can have. And as always, thank you for watching.